Yes, as a summary of the hazard.
You see the next section on this page is titled Anatomical Changes in the Brain.
Yes.
And it begins, studies of rats exposed to sodium fluoride or aluminum fluoride have reported distortion in cells in the outer and inner layers of the neocortex. Neuronal deformations were also found in the hippocampus and to a smaller extent in the amygdala and the cerebellum. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with that finding as a summary of the hazard.
As it relates to rat studies, yes.
Okay. And you see the next highlighted portion in that paragraph?
I do.
It reads, the substantial enhancement of reactive microglia, the presence of stained intracellular neurofilaments, and the presence of IgM observed in rodents are related to signs of dementia in humans. The magnitude of the changes was large and consistent among the studies. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with the NRC that this is a correct summary of the hazard.
Correct.
So, I don't know if you noticed, but he wasn't disputing any of that. Now we don't do studies on animals to see how fluoride affects rats. We study rats to see how fluoride affects us. We would never spend money just to understand, I wonder how rats are affected. So this is a scientist at the EPA, Dr. Christina Thayer. She's a high-level scientist. She's the director of EPA's Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division, very smart. And she has actually done research on fluoride in her career. And so I deposed her in the case. And she agreed that these animal studies support the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in humans. She understood that this is important data that we do need to take seriously when looking at the impact of fluoride on human health. And as you will talk about later, by the end of this case, EPA did accept that fluoride is a neurotoxicant, okay? We're gonna get there, but just so you know. So one of the other questions I wanted to ask in this case is, what is the dose of fluoride that is safe for the brain? Okay. Now, if you have had the misfortune of being involved with the campaigns to promote water fluoridation, you have probably heard that there's thousands of studies that prove that water fluoridation is completely safe. Some of the more enthusiastic proponents of fluoridation even say there's over 30,000 studies that prove that water fluoridation is safe, okay? I went a little bit kinder on the EPA. I just asked them for one study. I wanted to find out, just show me studies, a study, that would demonstrate that the levels of fluoride that we're exposed to are safe for the brain, okay? So what I did is I started with these companies that sell the chemicals that we add to water, okay, for fluoridation. The three largest companies in the United States at the time that sold these chemicals, Solvay, Simplot, Mosaic, I went to each of them and I asked them, do you have any data to show that fluoridation is safe for the brain? And what is the safe dose of fluoride for the brain? And they all came back, and this is just part of their answer, they all came back with the same response. We do not have any data on this subject, okay? So you're gonna have to look elsewhere. Okay, so I crossed the manufacturers off the list of people who might be able to show me the safety data. So let's now go somewhere else. I went to the Food and Drug Administration, which is the part of the US government that approves the safety and effectiveness of drugs. and I asked them if they had any safety data on fluoride in the brain. And they said, no, we've never conducted or sponsored any studies on this subject, and the FDA has no position on this topic. So they're not prepared to say that fluoridation is safe for the brain. They don't know. Okay, fair enough. So I crossed the FDA off the list, and I went on. The next place I went to was the NSF International. This is an organization that certifies the safety of the chemicals that towns add to their water. A lot of states require that water municipalities only buy chemicals that are certified by the NSF. So I figured maybe they have safety data, right? So let's see what they say.
Ask you, has NSF taken any steps to determine the potential for fluoridation chemicals to cause neurotoxic effects?
No.
Does NSF have any position on whether fluoridation chemicals can cause neurotoxic effects?
Since we have not conducted our own risk assessment on the fluoridation chemicals, we do not have a position on whether they are able to cause neurotoxic effects.
Okay.
Okay, so the NSF did not have any data, safety data on fluoride in the brain, so I crossed them off the list. So let's keep going. Let's see if someone else has. Okay, so who do we go to next? Oh, the CDC. You know, the people who tell us every single day that water fluoridation is completely safe, and you're kind of crazy if you're concerned about it, okay? So, any guesses on whether they have safety data?
So based on CDC's response to topic 10 and 11, it's correct to say that CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects for infants.
Yes.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes toddlers.
Mm-hmm.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on toddlers.
That's true.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes children?
Yes.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children.
Right, as stated in our response to the issue on 10 and 11, we don't conduct research ourselves related to tolerable upper fluoride intake. Again, that's under the jurisdiction of EPA's drinking water, and they set maximum and minimum containment levels about notifying people when levels are exceeded.
Okay. And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
As a rep of CDC, to my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that.
Okay.
To my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge. So, I had to cross the CDC off the list. But he did offer a really interesting clue, because he told me that the EPA, you hear that? They're the ones who have the data. Well, that was really cool because the EPA was the defendant in the case. So now let me take you down a very interesting little pathway. I want to tell you about what EPA's safe dose of fluoride is based upon, okay? I think you're going to find this kind of interesting, okay? Let's give it a shot. This is a condition called crippling skeletal fluorosis, okay? Excess fluoride will cause this condition, okay? And this is a summary of what it does. It causes crippling deformities of the spine and major joints, muscle wasting, neurologic defects, and compression of the spinal cord. If you get crippling skeletal fluorosis, you are in deep, deep trouble. It's a very severe condition, okay? Why am I talking about crippling skeletal fluorosis right now? Well, the EPA, when it set its safety standard for fluoride in the 1980s, considered crippling skeletal fluorosis to be the critical effect. Now let me tell you what critical effect means.
And critical adverse effect means the effect of a substance that occurs at the lowest dose, right?
Correct.
Okay. So according to EPA, the first adverse effect that can occur to the human organism from fluoride exposure is crippling skeletal fluorosis.
Correct.
According to EPA's safety standard, the first adverse effect that fluoride can cause to the human organism, oh, by the way, we're human organisms, is crippling skeletal fluorosis. In other words, according to the EPA, until you are crippled, until you have crippling skeletal fluorosis, you have not been harmed by fluoride. That was the basis of their safety standard. It is the one and only health effect that they sought to protect us from. The only health effect that they sought to protect us from was this. Okay? So let's unpack that a little bit further. What does that mean? Well,
And
crippling skeletal fluorosis is, as the name implies, it's the final, most advanced form of this bone disease that fluoride causes called skeletal fluorosis. Okay, so let's talk about the pre-crippling skeletal fluorosis. Okay, as EPA's, this is testimony from the case, from the same guy we just looked at. I asked, so EPA's MCLG, that's a wonky way of saying the safety standard. EPA's safety standard was designed to prevent phase 3 crippling skeletal fluorosis, right? Correct. But not to prevent clinical phase 2 skeletal fluorosis, okay? Correct. So what is pre-crippling skeletal fluorosis? Here we discuss phase 2.
EPA has defined stage 2 skeletal fluorosis as characterized
Yes.
by sporadic pain, stiffness of the joints, and osteosclerosis of the pelvis and spine, calcification of the ligaments, and at times osteoporosis of the long bones, correct?
Correct.
And as we discussed earlier, EPA did not consider stage 2 skeletal fluorosis to be an adverse health effect when it established the MCLG in 1985, correct?
Correct.
Calcification of the ligaments, joint pain, joint stiffness, osteosclerosis, which is a bone hardening, kind of brittle bone, and osteoporosis. None of that was considered adverse by the EPA. So they didn't bother to protect people from any of those conditions. Okay? I mean, I know we're not maybe all scientists in here, but what do you guys think? Do you think that sounds like adverse? So here's another thing that EPA knew in the 1980s when it set the safety standard. It knew, no question about it, that fluoride in excess amounts will cause this condition called severe dental fluorosis. Okay? Severe dental fluorosis is a mineralization disorder of tooth enamel caused by too much fluoride when we're children. And it results in an excess porosity of the enamel, like osteoporosis of the teeth, basically, which results in softening of the enamel and crumbling of the enamel. And also, because of it, the enamel is softer, it takes in staining more. So you see teeth with this brown and black staining. EPA said this is not an adverse health effect. Okay? This is not an adverse health effect. They said it's just cosmetic. Okay? Now, ask yourself if you were a teenager and you're trying to go out, maybe go on a date. You just ask yourself what that would be like, you know? So, this is Paul Price. Paul Price is the EPA scientist who wrote the safety standard in the 1980s. And I deposed him in this case. But he goes, I was just the typist. So I guess for fairness, I should say he was the typist. Okay? Now, in addition to being the typist, I said, so sir, you were the typist? He also wrote a mock press release right when they announced the standard. But he didn't share it with the public. He shared it with his colleagues at the EPA. And in this mock press release, he absolutely eviscerates the standard that he typed. And I asked him about that mock press release. In the mock press release, he said, this safety standard is going to allow up to 40% of children to have teeth gross enough to gag a maggot. That was his words, okay? And so here I ask him about something else he says in his press release.
Going back to the press release or the mock press release that you wrote, the last sentence of it reads, EPA selected this level based upon a cost-effectiveness study which showed that it is cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride. That's what you wrote, right?
That's correct.
And what did you mean by it's cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride?
I meant to be funny.
Now I understand you're being asked to write or type an indefensible standard, so there is a need for humor, right? And he said this was dark gallows humor, and I understand that. But I think if you're a child drinking water and develop that condition, it's not as funny. And so let's summarize where we are so far, okay? Let's summarize where we are so far. This is Joyce Donahue. Joyce Donahue was the senior scientist at EPA's Office of Water from the 1990s to the 2022. She was EPA's main expert on fluoride, okay? And here I just asked her to recap some of what we've discussed so far.
When you first started working at EPA in the 1990s, the EPA did not believe it would be an adverse health effect for a child to develop extensive pitting of the enamel as a result of fluoride exposure, right?
Based on what they wrote at that time.
Okay. And the EPA did not believe it would be an adverse health effect for a person to suffer chronic joint pain from fluoride exposure so long as they were not crippled, right?
By the definition of crippling skeletal fluorosis, one can, again, based on what was written, it would appear they did not.
Okay. Extensive pitting of tooth enamel, no problem. Chronic joint pain, no problem. Okay, not adverse to human health. That was the safety standard, okay? Now, there were scientists at the EPA who worked at their union, the headquarters union, okay, in Washington, D.C. And they were really upset about the safety standard. They did not think it was defensible for the agency to do this. And they were so upset, they tried to get the agency's attention, but the agency kept ignoring them. So they ultimately got to the point where they tried to join a lawsuit filed by an environmental organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. They tried to join this lawsuit by these environmentalists against their own bosses. So you have agency scientists trying to sue their bosses because of this safety standard, which is never before and never since been attempted by EPA scientists. And that shows you the extent to which they were concerned. Unfortunately, the court disallowed the agency scientists from challenging their bosses in court. But here's Robert Carton, and he was the president of EPA's headquarters union at that time. And here's some of what he said.
You want to support the NRDC in its challenge of the EPA's regulations.
Right.
Farm leading.
Which we didn't want to do. We made many attempts, as what we've shown here, of trying to get the attention of the powers that be and work it out. And they had no interest in it. So they forced us into finding another avenue, because this is serious business. You're talking about harming the health of lots and lots of people, and making false statements about what actually is a health effect and what isn't a health effect.
So, let's fast forward. So that's the safety standard that the EPA established in the 1980s, okay? Well, in the early 2000s, the EPA asked the National Research Council, the NRC, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, to review the scientific literature on fluoride and to determine whether this safety standard is safe. I mean, it's almost like you really have to even ask the National Research Council for that, but they did. And they spent 3 years reviewing the literature. I attended several of these meetings that they had, the National Research Council. And in 2006, the National Research Council published its report. And it concluded that this safety standard, which is 4 parts per million fluoride in the water, is too high, is not safe, and needs to be lowered, okay? The NRC said that severe dental fluorosis is an adverse health effect, right? It said that you can't just focus on crippling skeletal fluorosis, you have to look at the earlier stages of fluoride-induced bone disease, right? And it also flagged for the EPA that there's these other concerns with fluoride exposure, like effects on the brain, and effects on the thyroid gland, effects on the pineal gland, okay? And that EPA needs to consider some of these other impacts on human health, okay? So that was 2006. It was a really important moment, and it's a great report for those who want to learn more about how fluoride can impact human health. Well, what did EPA do? They did a risk assessment in 2010, okay? And what they concluded is, okay, we were wrong about severe dental fluorosis, okay? We accept that's an adverse effect. So they create a safe dose that protects against severe dental fluorosis. And they say, as long as you don't get severe dental fluorosis, you're good. It's the only thing we need to protect against. You protect against severe dental fluorosis, and you're gonna protect humans from every other effect of fluoride exposure, okay? Sound familiar to what they did in the 80s when they said you just need to protect against crippling skeletal fluorosis and you're all good? Now they updated that. They're making progress, a little slower than I would like, but now they're at, okay, severe dental fluorosis, protect against that and you're good, okay? So now, remember my question, what's the safe dose for fluoride in the brain? Now, if you read this report, they tell everybody, this is the safe dose, 0.08 milligrams per kilogram per day. That's safe. You're not gonna have any effect if you have less than that. So let's see how EPA handled this in this case. They said in this case that in determining whether adding fluoridation chemicals to drinking water presents an unreasonable risk of neurotoxic effects, EPA would not rely on the 2010 reference dose, okay? Would not rely on it, meaning they admitted this dose does not tell us anything about whether fluoride is safe for the brain. So they said, no, they accepted that. So EPA did not have a safe dose. They didn't know what it was. The only safe dose that they had come up with, they're admitting to the court, cannot be used to tell us whether this exposure is safe for the brain. Okay. So remember when Casey Hannon told me to go to the EPA? So I went to the EPA, I found their safe dose, they developed it in 2010, and now they're telling us that this does not apply to the brain. So that's where we're at. So let's turn to another question that I examined in this case in discovery. And that is whether ingesting fluoride provides any benefits to our teeth. Because when we started water fluoridation in the 1940s and 50s, the belief is that we needed to swallow fluoride. And we needed to swallow fluoride when we were young, in children, and that's gonna make our teeth stronger for life, okay? That was the premise of this whole program. So I wanted to understand, is that true? Do you actually get a benefit from swallowing this stuff? So, this is a subpoena, okay? One of the great things about being an attorney in federal court is you get the subpoena power of the federal court. And one of the first things I did in this case is I subpoenaed Stephen Levy. Stephen Levy has made millions upon millions of dollars since the 1990s doing a study where he's measuring how much fluoride children are ingesting. He has like a group of like 500 kids, okay? And every couple months he goes, he speaks with their parents, and they say like, how much did little Jimmy drink of the water? How much did they drink? How much toothpaste did they use? And he's creating these estimates of how much fluoride kids are ingesting, okay? And then he's doing examinations of their teeth to see if they have cavities and to see if they have dental fluorosis. So the whole point of this study is, what is the relationship between our total fluoride ingestion and tooth decay, cavities, right? It's a great data set. I've really wanted to get a hold of this for a long time. So the thing about Stephen Levy is he really likes water fluoridation. He promotes it all around the country. And for some reason in his papers, he really hasn't talked a whole lot about the relationship between fluoride ingestion and tooth decay in his data set that he's receiving millions of dollars to study. It's kind of a curious omission. You went to the federal government asking for millions of dollars to find out how fluoride ingestion relates to tooth decay, and you're not telling us a whole lot about what you're finding. I figured there was probably something there, okay? I mean, he has mentioned in passing that, oh, by the way, this, he's mentioned some unfavorable things, but not very much. So, I get all of his data on fluoride ingestion, okay, and tooth decay. Now, this right here is the amount of tooth decay, okay? So the higher you go up, the more tooth decay you have, okay? And then this is total fluoride ingestion. So the further over here you are, the more fluoride you're ingesting, okay? So if fluoride ingestion is reducing tooth decay, you would see tooth decay decline as you go to the right, okay? Because this is more ingestion, okay? Now, this data is for total fluoride intake for the first 6 years of life, okay? And this is tooth decay at age 13, okay? And this graph is unadjusted, meaning we're just looking at fluoride exposure and tooth decay with no adjustment for like parental income, parental education, all that stuff. This is all of those other covariates like parental income, parental education that can influence tooth decay, okay? Now look at this line. Does that look like a significant benefit for you? It is a flat line, meaning as fluoride ingestion on tooth decay, okay? And then, when you adjust for all those other factors, fluoride still doesn't have an effect on tooth decay. I think Dr. Levy should have made this more clear to the public that funded this study. This is why he got the data. But he's really never made much of it. So let's go back to the CDC, okay? Because I asked the director of Division of Oral Health about fluoride in teeth. So the first thing you'll see here is he admits there is overwhelming evidence that fluoride's predominant benefit to the teeth is topical, not systemic. But remember, the whole point of this program when we started is that it was systemic, meaning you had to ingest it, okay?
And then Featherstone writes, there is now overwhelming evidence that the primary caries preventive mechanisms of action of fluoride are post-eruptive through topical effects for both children and adults. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And the CDC agrees with that statement, correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So overwhelming evidence today, it's a topical, predominantly topical effect, okay? And so I wanted to flesh that out. And I asked him about whether there are benefits from the mother drinking fluoridated water when the baby's in the womb, okay, prenatal. And the reason I wanted to ask the CDC this is because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, there is a concern, particular concern, about fluoride's impact on the brain during the early phases of life, because the brain is more vulnerable to the impact of toxic chemicals in the womb and then early infancy. And so I want to better understand, like, is there a benefit that could offset that risk, okay?
The CDC's conclusion in 2001 is that they had good evidence, high quality evidence, to show that fluoride supplements do not provide a benefit for children when given during pregnancy, correct?
Yeah, when given to pregnant women.
Okay.
So CDC had good quality evidence by 2001 that prenatal fluoride supplementation does not provide a benefit to the teeth of the baby, okay? So then I asked them, okay, so just to confirm, if someone from the public was to contact the CDC and ask if fluoridated water was going to be beneficial for their baby, what would you say? So let's see what he said.
So if pregnant mother wrote an email to CDC asking, if I drink fluoridated water during my pregnancy, will that provide a benefit to the teeth of my baby? CDC would not answer yes to that question, correct?
If we were to get an email as such, we would summarize our understanding of the evidence in saying, we have not found evidence that supports that shows benefit to the child if ingested, if community water fluoridation or some other form of fluoride is ingested by the mother.
Okay. So, no benefit from drinking the fluoridated water when the baby's in the womb, okay? So if there's a risk, there's nothing to offset that risk, okay? So then I asked him about early life, so the first few months of infancy. And here, something really important that I should say. Bottle-fed babies are probably the most vulnerable age group in our population for fluoride. Because breast milk contains virtually no fluoride, which is instructive because breast milk typically has the nutrients and minerals that we need for healthy development, okay? So when the breast milk contains no fluoride, it kind of indicates that a young baby does not need it, right? And there are probably good reasons not to give the baby fluoride, right? But when you bottle feed a baby and you reconstitute the formula with fluoridated water, you flip that on its head. You go from the baby having the lowest exposure to fluoride among all age groups in the population to the highest exposure. A bottle-fed baby receives more fluoride per day than any of us, okay? The highest exposure by a factor of like 4 to 5, okay? And that's a concern because the blood-brain barrier is not fully formed until 6 months of age. So toxic substances that get into the baby's body have access to the brain, okay? And the brain is still undergoing rapid development and thus more vulnerable to the impact of a toxic substance, okay? So there's reason for concern about giving a bottle-fed baby fluoridated water. So let's see what the CDC says about whether there are benefits during this period of life that could offset or justify that risk.
Is the CDC aware of any evidence demonstrating benefits from consumption of fluoridated drinking water during the first 6 months of life?
We are not aware of any evidence.
Okay. So there's no benefit to justify that exposure that millions upon millions upon millions of kids have had. When you think about how in the United States alone, you have, in our court case, the data showed that every year in the United States, there were 400,000 babies that were exclusively fed formula reconstituted with fluoridated water for the first 6 months of life. Exclusive. It was their only source of caloric intake, okay? Every single year, okay? And there's no benefit. The CDC is acknowledging there's no benefit to justify that. So when we think, I think this is an important, when we think about risk-benefit, like, let's think about that age group. And I guess I would ask, I think a question here with water fluoridation is, should the water supply, the public water supply that we all pay for, should it be safe for everybody? Or should it just be safe for some people? Should a young mom be able to count on the tap water to be safe for her child? And, so I think this really, I think, highlights one of the problems when you're giving fluoride to everybody in the population, right? This is what happens when you add it to the drinking water. Okay, this brings us to the next chapter, which is trial, okay? And I have to say, the Toxic Substance Control Act was passed in 1976, okay? And until this case, no citizen group had ever taken a citizen petition all the way to a trial. So this was the first time in over 44 years of the statute that a federal judge had a trial under this statute. And the first trial took place in the summer of 2020, so during the height of the COVID situation. And so it was by Zoom. And I just want to kind of quickly talk about the experts that the court had that testified, that the court listened to in this case, because I think it's important to understand the caliber of the scientist that. Okay.
Just wondering about the air conditioner. Just wondering about the air conditioner, because apparently it's up this way somewhere. Just wanted to turn it down a bit, because there's a lot of us, make it a bit colder. Make it colder. Make it colder. Yep. So he needs to come through.
I'm impressed. There's so many people here, but it's getting a little hot. But it's good.
Now, the thing I was thinking, if any of the younger ones want to.
But I am coming from the northern hemisphere where it's currently winter, so I'm really enjoying it. So I want to just talk to you a little bit now about the experts that testified, because I think it's important to consider that as to who the court had access to for this case. And we called Dr. Howard Hu is an internationally renowned scientist who studied the impact of various chemicals on human health. And most importantly, Dr. Hu is the principal scientist. Oh, Dr. Hu. So Dr. Hu, he is the principal scientist on a birth cohort study in Mexico City, okay, where they're studying pregnant moms who were exposed to fluoridated salt. Okay, the fluoridated salt is designed to hit the same dose of fluoride as fluoridated water, so the so-called optimal level, okay? And in this study, Dr. Hu has measured the level of fluoride in the urine of the moms during pregnancy, which is a measure of total fluoride exposure, okay? And then when the children are born at various intervals, ages 4, 6, and 12, Dr. Hu and his team have measured the children's IQ, okay? And they have found, these studies were funded, this study was funded by the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, okay? And what Dr. Hu has found is that as the mother's fluoride exposure goes up, the child's IQ goes down. Okay, so there is a statistically significant relationship between the mother's exposure and the child's IQ. Okay? So we called Dr. Who? We also called Dr. Bruce Lanphier. Dr. Lanphier was the scientist who established that low levels of lead can reduce IQ. His research on lead has been cited by government agencies around the world to protect us from lead. Okay? Now, Dr. Lanphier has recently shifted his focus to fluoride, and he's been the principal scientist or co-principal scientist on a birth cohort in Canada where the mothers are exposed to fluoridated drinking water. So not fluoridated salt, fluoridated drinking water. Same level, actually, the levels that they add are a little bit less than New Zealand adds to its water. Okay? And Dr. Lanphier and his team have found that as the mother's fluoride exposure goes up, that the IQ of the child goes down. And although with Dr. Lanphier's study, some of the measures of fluoride, like the urinary fluoride, were only associated with reductions in IQ in the boys, not the girls. So it was a little bit different than what Dr. Who found. Now, interestingly, boys today are known to have elevated rates of neurodevelopmental disorders than girls. So it's something that to consider. So we also called Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who was a scientist who published these seminal studies on mercury and IQ. He did a study in the Faroe Islands where they found that mothers who had elevated mercury, there was an association with childhood IQ. He's been studying fluoride, and he testified for us in this case, which was great. We also had Dr. Kathleen Thiessen, a risk assessment scientist, who was one of the authors of the National Research Council's 2006 report that we looked at earlier. So I was thrilled with the experts that I was able to assemble and testify. I was really honored, frankly, to have them on our side. So you want to see who EPA called? Okay. Exponent. Now, I sue large corporations in the United States, sued many of them, okay? And their favorite go-to research institute is Exponent, like a science for hire, okay? Dow, Monsanto, you name it. The largest corporations that have products to defend, they go to Exponent. It's one of the biggest consulting firms on this, okay? EPA went to Exponent to defend the safety of fluoridation, not to its own scientists, okay? Which I was actually kind of happy about. They did, though, EPA did call one of its own scientists, Tala Henry, but she admitted that she's never worked on fluoride before in her life. She's never worked on any fluoride regulations, never read any of the fluoride studies before this case. And she didn't do an analysis of the literature in this case. What she did is she said, based on what Exponent scientists have found, I don't think there's a risk of fluoridation to the brain. So let's look at some of the evidence that we showed at trial. And I've already discussed some of this, but basically we spent we talked about the vulnerability of the developing brain, which we've talked about, and how this is from Dr. Grandjean. The brain is particularly sensitive to toxic exposures during development, which involves a complex series of steps that must be completed in the right sequence at the right time. So you really got to be careful about exposing a young child to a toxic element in terms of brain development. The EPA admitted, this is an undisputed fact, that fluoride passes through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. So if the mom's exposed to fluoride during pregnancy, that fluoride does have access to the baby's brain, which is a concern. And then the trial really focused on these birth cohort studies funded by the NIH, and the strengths of these studies, including extensive vetting from the NIH, extensive peer review, extensive control for other factors that affect IQ, like the mom's education, the parent's income, other exposures to toxic chemicals. They were controlling for those factors so as to make sure that there wasn't some artifactual association between fluoride and IQ. And we just focus on the other strengths of the NIH studies. The EPA agreed that these NIH Earth cohort studies were well conducted, methodologically reliable studies. And here I showed the court testimony from EPA scientists that I obtained through deposition. Okay, so EPA didn't call them as experts, but I called them to the stand. Okay, and here's Joyce Donahue again, and she's the senior scientist and a fluoride expert for the EPA. And I asked her here about these NIH-funded studies.
You would agree that this study right here adds further reason why we need to do a reassessment of the fluoride safety standards in the United States.
I think it's a reason for doing not just the United States. I think it's a reason for doing an update to the fluoride assessment.
Everywhere.
Well, for anybody who's interested in fluoride and the need for regulation of fluoride exposure.
Right. And anyone interested in making sure that fluoride is safe for consumption.
That people are not overexposed, yes.
Okay.
So what Dr. Donahue is saying here is that these new studies finding impacts, relationships between fluoride and cognitive development warrant a reassessment of our safety standards, which are still based upon these severe bone effects and severe dental fluorosis, that we need to be moving away from that kind of paradigm to be considering these other effects. And the judge did cite this testimony as significant in his view. So here's something that's really, important from this first trial. I have been saying for a long time that EPA has used a double standard with fluoride, that they're not using their own risk assessment principles for assessing whether fluoride is causing us any harm, okay? And at trial, it came out. We showed that that is in fact what's happening. And here on the stand, Tala Henry, it was a great moment at trial. I said, you held the plaintiffs to a burden of proof that EPA has not held a single chemical under TSCA before, correct? And she goes, by the words on the page, I guess that's true. This isn't just any chemical. This is a chemical that they're adding to millions of people's water supply, right? And she agreed they're holding this to a burden of proof that they don't hold other toxic chemicals to. The judge picked up on this. So we finished closing arguments, okay? And the judge begins this soliloquy that goes for a while. And he notes that the EPA appears to have applied a standard of causation, which from my read of TSCA is not accurate. It is not a proper application. It's not the proper standard. He got it. They were using a double standard. They were not bringing their own risk assessment principles to bear on fluoride. I'm liking that. And then the judge says, hey, there is serious evidence here. There is no doubt that these two studies from Canada and Mexico raise serious questions. Okay, this is June 17, 2020, soliloquy right after closing argument. I'm thinking we're gonna win. I'm like, okay, this is looking really good, okay? We're moments away from the judge saying, plaintiffs, you win, okay? I'm really feeling good, but not so fast. The judge put the case on hold. So here's what the thinking was, okay? He goes, I've heard that there is this new government review underway by an organization at the Department of Health and Human Services in the US government called the National Toxicology Program. And they are specifically studying how fluoride affects IQ, or if it affects IQ. And the court says, I want to hear what the NTP has to say. So let's wait until they're done. Now, does anyone have any sense of how I might have felt by that? I have observed the US government for a long time. How would I say it? Violate the public trust on fluoride. So the notion that our case is going to be held and wait for the US government to tell us what's going on gave me a little bit of heartburn. But I also understood it from the judge's vantage point, right? Because we're asking the judge to do something that's quite significant and difficult. We're asking this judge to make an official pronouncement that water fluoridation is causing neurotoxic effects in children. So we're asking the judge to do a lot, and I think it was reasonable for the judge to want to hear what this government agency was going to say. So let's see what happened next. The stay. This was the summer of 2020, okay? So we waited for the NTP, and we waited. And we waited. And in the summer of 2022, so 2 years later, I get contacted by a person with knowledge, a person who knows what is happening at the federal level. And she tells me the NTP finished its report. They're not being allowed to release it to the public. They may never release this report. When I heard that, I was obviously very concerned because my court case is waiting for that report. So what happens if the report never comes out, right? So here's what I did. In the United States, we have a law called the Freedom of Information Act. I love this law. I filed request after request to the CDC, to the FDA, to the National Toxicology Program, to the Public Health Service, to the Assistant Secretary of Health, to the Chief Dental Officer, and I asked for all of their communications on this report because I wanted to find out what was going on, okay? And somehow or another, there was a very kind FOIA officer at the CDC. And on October 30th, 2022, she gave us 4,000 pages of emails. And this, by the way, is my fiance, Emily, and she and I would always read these FOIA emails. Whenever we got new batches of FOIA emails, we would read them together. She's like, don't read those until I'm there with you, because we really enjoyed reading these emails. So let me show you some of what we found, okay? April 28th, 2022, the NTP sends an email to the CDC this is to the CDC, they sent the same email to the FDA and to the National Institute of Dental Research. And they say, attached as a pre-publication draft of the NTP report. At this time, the analysis and the conclusions are set. We are working towards its release in mid to late May. So what the NTP is saying is we've completed our report and we're going to release it in mid-May. And then on May 11th, a few weeks later, the NTP sends the email to all those same government agencies and says, we have set May 18th for publication of the monograph, the fluoride report, right? 7 days away. Well, something happened. Because the CDC was furious, okay? This is a meeting that happened on May 4th between the CDC and officials at the American Dental Association and other private dental lobbyists, where Tracy Bamer, the fluoridation engineer for the CDC, reports that the CDC was in the process of proactively and preemptively taking steps to intervene, okay? So the CDC is working to stop this report. This is an email from Gregory Holder, a CDC policy analyst, who says, don't know if it's time to call in the big guns from the Office of Director, but I view this report with extreme displeasure, and I am sure they will too. So the CDC was not happy with the NTP report, which guess what? Indicates it's probably a good report. Then the CDC is going up to the Assistant Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, and they're pleading with the Assistant Secretary to intervene and to stop the NTP from publishing its report. And here, Gregory Holder says CDC officials, Assistant Secretary for Health, Rachel Levine, and others have looked at the monograph and are pushing back hard at NTP, okay? Pushing back hard, and they did, and they succeeded, because by June 3rd, 2022, the CDC reports, the latest we heard yesterday is that Assistant Secretary of Health Levine has put the report on hold until further notice. And it was shortly after that email when I was contacted by this person with knowledge, and who told me your report may never come out. And she was right. At that point in time, it was really a real question mark as to whether the NTP was going to be permitted to release the report. Now, I'm happy to say that in these emails, one of the things we found is that there were people at the National Toxicology Program who were really pushing back against this pressure on them. They wanted to release this report. They recognized its importance to public health. And one of those officials was Brian Berridge, who was the scientific director of the NTP, okay? And in this email, which is from May of 22, he says, after 17 years in industry, he used to work in the pharmaceutical industry. After 17 years in industry, I've seen efforts to modify messages to fit commercial interests. I wasn't party to that there, and I'm not getting to do that here. He stood up for his staff. He stood up for his team of scientists. But he then resigned in protest because he said the violations of scientific integrity, he didn't want any part with it. So he did leave. So I go to court. I said, Your Honor, we can't keep waiting for this. It's like waiting for Godot. And the judge agreed. The judge lifts the stay and he says, listen, I wanted that report. I wanted it. But I'm now prepared to proceed without this report. Prepared to go and make a verdict. Okay? So I'm like, yes, that's great. And I go, Your Honor, I want that May 2022 NTP report. I want it. And the judge says, you should get it. And he looked at the EPA and says, I think the plaintiffs deserve that report. And initially, the Department of Justice okay? They are saying, no, it's confidential, okay? It's privileged, okay? Well, guess what I found out? They had given this report, the government gave that report within days of having that draft in May of 2022. Someone gave it to the American Dental Association. An American Dental Association lobbyists were busy tearing it apart, sending emails, smearing the NTP, right? And yet the government then told me that it's confidential, that we shouldn't have access to it, but they're giving it to the American Dental Association? Well, once I brought that fact to their attention, because I got emails from the CDC showing that the American Dental Association had it, they relented and they gave me a copy of the report. So we got it. We got the May 2022 NTP report. So let's look at the next chapter in this whole thing. And that's the second trial that happened last year, January, February 2024. And at that trial, the focus was, what did the National Toxicology Program find? And what are the implications for water fluoridation? I'm happy to say that Dr. Barrett, the scientific director, agreed to fly across the country, come to court, and tell the judge about why he signed off on that report and why he felt it was a rigorous, thorough review that should have been published, okay? And on the stand, I asked Dr. Barrett, prior to the fluoride monograph, when you, the scientific director, determined that the report was final and complete, was the report always published? Answer, yes, but not with fluoride. They took that decision away from him. He was the scientific director. He determined it was ready to go. It should be released. And they took that decision from him. They said no. So the judge heard that. So then we talked about the NTP's findings. Okay, so let's look at the NTP's findings. The NTP found that there is a large body of evidence on IQ effects in children. A large number of studies now linking fluoride exposure to reduced IQ. The NTP found that the reported associations between higher fluoride exposure and lower children's IQ are consistent in the vast majority of studies of both low and high quality. The NTP stated that, in summary, the high quality studies, i.e. studies with low potential for bias, consistently demonstrate lower IQ scores with higher fluoride exposure, okay? If someone had told me when the judge said this case was going on hold for this, that this was gonna be the conclusion, I wouldn't have believed it. So I was thrilled to see the NTP release a report this strong. Now the NTP did condition its conclusion on saying that this consistent association, that its confidence in this association was really driven by studies looking at communities with 1.5 parts per million of fluoride in the water, okay? Now that's about 2 times more than Rotorua adds to its water, okay? And so it's a little bit higher, okay? And we're gonna talk more about that. But they are saying there's a consistent association between these elevated fluoride levels and reduced IQ. And the NTP said that confounding, bias due to confounding, is not considered to be a concern. What does that mean? What they're saying there is, we don't think this association is the result of failing to control for parental education or parental income, things like that. We think that the association is a valid association. It's not an artifactual one. So they say a spurious association is unlikely. That's important because they're saying this association needs to be taken seriously. It looks like fluoride is the cause of this lower IQ. And the NTP also pointed out in some of its communications, this is from communication between it and some of the other federal agencies, it pointed out that even in fluoridated areas like in Rotorua, am I pronouncing that right? I'm sorry if I'm not.
Close enough. Close enough. We know how to pronounce it.
So what they found is that even in fluoridated communities, some women, and we're focusing here on pregnant women because that was a particular concern for IQ loss, that some women have levels of fluoride in their urine, which is a measure of total fluoride exposure, that are right in the same, range that we're seeing IQ deficits, right? So there's an overlap of exposure between fluoridated communities and these higher fluoridated communities where the NTP was expressing particular concern, okay? So I'm in the middle of trial. I'm talking about the NTP report. I'm really liking this NTP report, okay? And the surprise happens. I get home from trial one day and I have an email which says there's a new report out, a new government report on fluoride and IQ from Canada. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm sure it's bad, And well, it turns out it wasn't actually written by Health Canada, but it was written by scientists that Health Canada had contracted with to do a review of fluoride and IQ and other health effects. And to my surprise, it was a really good review. And they said, quote, the overall evidence identified to date strongly suggests that fluoride can affect cognitive outcomes in children, specifically reduction in IQ scores at levels close to those currently seen in North American drinking water. Right in the middle of trial, I get this report. So the next morning I go to court, I go, Your Honor, I have a development, it's not my fault, I promise, it just came out. And the judge was like, I want it in evidence. So we brought this report into evidence, and every expert that then took the stand had to address the RSI report. I was very happy about that. So let's now talk about the two key admissions that the government made in this case. Okay, the first is one that I touched upon earlier, and that is that the EPA and their experts admitted that fluoride is a neurotoxicant. That fluoride can damage the brain. Okay? That if you ingest too much of it, it can damage your brain. Okay? So let's look at some of the testimony on that. This is EPA's expert, Jesus Ibarra-Lucerda.
Do you agree that at least at high doses, the epidemiological evidence is consistent in showing an association between fluoride and adverse neurodevelopmental symptoms? Given the findings from the high-dose epidemiological literature, do you agree that at least at high doses, fluoride is a neurotoxin?
Yes.
This is EPA's expert. He says yes, he agrees it's a neurotoxin. Okay. Oh, so I went to Spain to depose this guy, and it was a grueling deposition. I do like long depositions. And a few days later, I got a phone call from the Department of Justice attorney. Says, Michael, Dr. Ibarra-Lucerda has contacted us and said he wants nothing to do with this case anymore. I said, I think that's a good sign. So this is Dr. Stanley Barone, who is EPA's main and the key witness in the court case. He is a risk assessment expert for the EPA, and he's a real bona fide expert. He's worked on all of their risk evaluations under this Toxic Substances Control Act. He knows what he's talking about. And in this clip, I'm talking with him about the NTP's findings, okay? And I'm trying to I want to know if he agrees that NTP's conclusions that we looked at, whether that meets the threshold for neurotoxicity for EPA, like whether that satisfies the standard of, it's called a sufficient human evidence standard for neurotoxicity, okay? Because if you meet that standard, it's a neurotoxicant, okay? So let's see what he said.
You would certainly agree that based on NTP's assessment of the literature as of April 2021, that there was sufficient human evidence of a neurotoxicity hazard as defined under the EPA guidelines.
Again, associating fluoride exposure from multiple routes and multiple sources, there's an association. But again, relating that back to drinking water alone, most of the studies are looking at total fluoride. They're not looking specifically at fluoride from drinking water.
Okay, but in terms of total fluoride exposure, you would agree that the literature that NTP reviewed up through April 2021 meets EPA's sufficient human evidence standard under the guidelines.
For hazard ID,
Okay. You agree with that?
I would agree that there's significant evidence there for a sufficiency call.
Right. And you agree that it meets the sufficient human evidence standard?
It meets the sufficient evidence standard.
So it took a while. He's telling me the evidence is significant. I like that. I appreciate that. But I just really want to know, is it sufficient human evidence under the guidelines? And he gave it to me. Yes, it meets the standard. Check. Okay? Fluoride is a neurotoxicant. Now, he also agreed that the NTP report is a high quality review. Just keep that in mind if you hear your Ministry of Health tell you that NTP's assessment is not high quality. Well, EPA had every reason in the world in this case to say it wasn't a high quality review, but they didn't. They accepted that it's a high quality review. So let's look at the second key admission here. EPA did something, or Dr. Barone did something in this case which EPA has never before done. Ever. He admitted that you need a margin of safety for fluoride to protect against the neurotoxicity hazard. Okay? So a margin of safety, what is this based on? Margin of safety means, what it's based on is that one size, one dose does not fit all with a toxic substance or a drug. Okay? Some people are more resistant, and some people are more vulnerable. Okay? We know that. Time and time and time again, we find that with any toxic substance you can imagine. You give this person this dose, and you give this person the same dose, one of them will be harmed, and the other won't. Okay? There's various reasons for it, and we don't understand all those reasons. We just know that there's variability, right? With fluoride, we know that people with nutrient deficiencies of calcium, of iodine, that they're more vulnerable to fluoride. We know that people with kidney disease are more vulnerable to fluoride because they can't excrete it from their body very well, okay? So we know that there's people more vulnerable. We know genetic variation. We know that genetics plays a very important role in how people respond to fluoride. But what we don't know is who has those genetic polymorphisms that are going to make you more or less vulnerable. It's like Russian roulette. Who is it in this room? No one can tell you that. The government can't tell you that. No one's going to come in and say, you are the one who's going to be most vulnerable. And because we know there's this variability in how people respond, there's this concept of margin of safety. You need to, so you take your safe level, or so you take the hazard level, and you have to divide it by a margin so you make sure that you're going to protect everybody in the population. So here, Dr. Barone, now the EPA uses a lot of wonky language that I have to keep interpreting for the court. They don't use the words margin of safety. That would be too easy. They use the term benchmark MOE, or benchmark margin of exposure. So I asked Dr. Barone, have you given any thought to what the benchmark MOE should be.
Did you give any consideration as to what an appropriate benchmark MOE should be for fluoride neurotoxicity?
Yeah, I did. Given that the critical studies in question are probably epidemiological studies, human studies, a certain factor of 10, which is appropriate for all life stages, inclusive of all life stages and vulnerabilities at face value, would be the benchmark MOE.
Okay.
So, a margin of safety of 10. So let's talk about, let's play that out for a second. Remember the NTP? The NTP said that the hazard level was 1.5, okay? You take your margin of safety of 10, you divide 1.5 by 10, and what do you have? You have 0.15. 0.15 is much less than we add to water for water fluoridation, okay? So under EPA risk assessment principles, what that means is you have a risk. You have a risk of neurotoxicity to the public. We don't know who's going to be affected. We don't know if it's going to be you. We don't know if it's going to be you. We don't know if it's going to be you. But we're confident that there are going to be people who are harmed. Okay? That was a major admission from the EPA. What was the key dispute? The key dispute goes back to that question I wanted an answer to from the very beginning of this court case, which is, what is that dose that goes from safe to toxic? What is the dose that you can ingest without having it impact your brain? Okay? And the court wanted to know, what is that hazard level? And our expert, Dr. Grandjean, he came up with an estimate of 0.3 parts per million in the urine of the pregnant mom is associated with reductions in IQ. That was based on the benchmark dose analysis. And we saw the NTP as 1.5 in the water. And then Stanley Barone, let's see what he has to say.
As it stands now, would you dispute that fluoride at concentrations above 2 parts per million is associated with neurotoxic effects?
I think there's something going on. I'm not sure exactly at what level.
And is something, you would agree that above 2 parts per million, something's going on? Okay.
The systematic review that NTP did, and I think the Vernier also is sort of pointing in that direction.
So something's going on. What that means is something's going on in your brain, okay, at above 2 parts per million. So the court, we finished evidence in the case. I'm feeling good about it right now, okay? The court sends us an email and says, I want answers to some questions for your closing arguments. And one of the answers I want is I want to know what you're prepared to accept as to what the hazard level is. He asks us, he cites Barone's testimony. He says, will EPA concede that, the court asks EPA if it will concede that 2 parts per million is the hazard level, given what Dr. Barone testified to, right? Well, guess what their attorney said? Ready for this? They said, the cited testimony by Dr. Barone, he said somewhere over 2 parts per million, okay? He said that could be anywhere from 2 to infinity. So the EPA is like, Your Honor, 2 parts per million. He said over 2 parts per million. It might have been infinity. So, trial ends, finished closing arguments, and then we waited. We've been here before. And we waited. March came, March goes. The summer comes and the summer goes. We have no decision from the court. No decision from the court. And then on September 24th, 2024, after 7.5 years of litigation, I get an email from the court with its findings of fact and conclusions of law, an 80-page document analyzing the evidence in the case. And the court concludes, the court finds that fluoridation of water at 0.7 milligrams per liter, the level presently considered optimal in the United States, poses an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children. We won the case. The court continued, in all, there is substantial and scientifically credible evidence establishing that fluoride poses a risk to human health. It is associated with a reduction in the IQ of children and is hazardous at dosages that are far too close to fluoride levels in the drinking water of the United States. The court recognized that reduced IQ is a serious health problem and ordered the EPA to take regulatory action to address the neurological risk posed by water fluoridation. So, just quickly, we're gonna wrap up right here because I know it's getting hot. The aftermath. Robert Kennedy, about a month after our decision, announces that if he gets into the new administration, he will take action. I was happy that he cited me in his tweet, so I was happy about that. But then, following Robert Kennedy's tweet, the Surgeon General for Florida, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, announced he issued recommendations for Florida that communities stop adding fluoride to their water. He called, ready for this? He called water fluoridation, quote, public health malpractice. In the wake of the court's ruling and Robert Kennedy's statement and then the Dr. Ladapo's recommendations, we've had 34 communities now end water fluoridation. We've had dozens, we currently have dozens of additional communities currently considering whether they will stop their programs. And I think there's a hearing tonight in Florida in Hillsborough County about ending their fluoridation program. So we're seeing momentum that we have never seen before on the fluoridation issue. The next chapter in all this is yours to write here in New Zealand. And I hope that you are able to find some way to bring back choice to your communities so that the Ministry of Health no longer forces you to fluoridate your water whether you want it or not. Because right now, the Ministry of Health, if it directs you to fluoridate your water, and if you do not obey its order, they will fine you every day. I was in Whangarei in northern New Zealand on Saturday, and actually earlier too. And their council does not want to fluoridate its water. Their people do not want to fluoridate their water. And the Ministry of Health has told them, if you do not fluoridate your water by March 30th, you will be fined $200,000. And not only will you be fined $200,000, you will be fined $10,000 for every day that you do not fluoridate your water. The community is pleading with the Ministry of Health, don't force us to do this. And the ministry has told them, again, in a letter last Thursday, tough, you're fluoridating your water or we're fining you. And that is a ministry that does not respect your rights. Because in medicine, there is a long cherished right. And that is the right of informed consent. You may love fluoride, God bless you. I don't want to ingest it. I don't want my family to ingest it. I should have that right. I may look at the risks differently than you do. That's okay. We all do that every day. It's an individual choice. And when the government refuses to hear you when you plead for that choice,
and they force you to do it anyway. That is a government that is not respecting your rights. So I am hopeful that we can find through, and I think one of the ways forward here would be to find MPs who can push back on the Ministry of Health, because the Ministry of Health is not elected, right? So anyway, I've been going on too long. I think I'm getting the signal that it's time to close down the talk. But I just want to say, it's been a pleasure talking here today. I really appreciate your attention here, despite it being hot in the room. And I really appreciate you all coming out today. And I hope you learned something. And I hope together you can maybe bring about some change with the current status quo on fluoride. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we're going to hand it over.